Cool. At least we have a few more people online. Guess they'll get it when they get it. All right. First things first. Move that up here. Here's our Blackboard site. Some of you, a couple of you missed lab for reasons. I already said this in my Thursday class, but when you go down to this Lab 9 Spatial Dispersion and Analysis, it's where we had our handouts and the tables and stuff. I also linked a YouTube playlist. So what I did, and I'm sure, you know, at least I know in Tuesday and Thursday we did it this way. I kind of stepped you through how to do the calculations on Excel, how to calculate the coefficient of dispersion using formulas, and using formulas to calculate your t-observed values, and then using our tables to get those critical values. So I have a playlist where one video does the coefficient of dispersion, the other video does our coefficient of association, also in Excel. So I broke it up into two different videos. If you happen to miss lab, go contact your lab instructor, have them send you your lab data so that you can practice doing these calculations. I did go pretty quick in these videos. I think total length for both of them is a little over 30 minutes. But I did that because you can easily play and rewind, or pause and rewind. So I wanted to let you know that that's what I've done. So if you missed lab, you know, you don't have to try to figure it out on your own. You can use some videos. All right. Next week's lab is demography. Make sure you bring both of these handouts, because if we look ahead, we'll do demography, learn how to work with life tables, do all of our calculations with life tables, and then we also have an introduction. So we'll introduce this lab, this allelopathy lab, and explain what we're going to do, because then you have to have something set up. You have to actually come up with your experiment, make our leachates and so forth, so that the next week, when we do our community similarity lab, you're going to set up the allelopathy lab so that it runs for a week, and then that week after that, that's when we'll collect our data. So the allelopathy is technically like 3 different handouts. Make sure you read them. All right, so we left off sex ratios. All right. So several things can affect sex ratios. This is just a small sample, especially when it comes to genetic factors. We're just going to say XXXY. That's going to determine our primary sex ratios. All right. And it's these primary sex ratios that tend to feel the full force of selection, because you could be genetically male or genetically female, yet phenotypically the opposite sex. All right, we have examples of organisms switching. All right, some fish will switch. So if natural selection is favoring what you're not exhibiting, or what your genetic constitution doesn't say, then selection is going to have a hard time selecting for those traits. Examples that we have always used have been the phenotypic plasticity. All right, if you're tall because of the environment and selection is favoring tall individuals, it's really not selecting anything, because its genetic code didn't code for that. You weren't programmed for that. So the same thing with our genetic factors. Ecological factors that can produce changes in our sex ratio was the differential survivorship normally observed in male versus females. Males tend to exhibit higher mortality rates, and then also the environmental effects. And we talked about this Jack in the Pulpit, and we also talked about some turtles and alligators. And I saw when we finished up that, yeah, in some of our turtles, some of our reptiles, it's not just, it doesn't go to where if it's warmer, you're going to be female. And some of them, if you're warmer, it's going to be male offspring. And also, there are some cases where it's not like an either or, it's if you're within a temperature range, you're one sex, and if you're outside of that range, so higher or lower, you're the opposite sex. So there's a lot of things going on with that. We're going to leave this, the actual process for other classes. Maybe herpetology, we'll talk about it. Maybe developmental. Maybe you can get developmental biology class to talk about it, because it's kind of interesting how they do that. And I said we ended with this plants. So plants present a pretty unique problem because of the variation we have across the plant world. Some of our plants are dioecious, where we have separate male and female plants. Some of our plants are monoecious, and in those monoecious plants we could have separate male and female flowers, or we can have flowers that have both sex organs. And the question then becomes is, how do we determine our sex ratio? And you'd be tempted to say, well, if we have dioecious plants, then we could do our traditional sex ratios. We just count how many male plants there are and how many female plants there are. But that's only kind of part of the story, because even on our plants itself, the male plants, they might produce different number of male flowers relative to the female plants, or vice versa. All right, so how do we account for this variation throughout the plant world? And it kind of comes down to what your interest is, what the biological question is. So one way that we can address these sex ratios is to avoid just the whole male versus female plant distinction or male versus female flower distinction, and instead count the number of stamens or the number of pistils that are there. That kind of eliminates the variation in number of flowers on an individual, and instead says across our entire population, this is how many males, this is how many stamens we have, this is how many pistils we have. So there are male versus female plant parts. All right? And the same thing would apply if we're dealing with monoecious plants. So with separate flowers, you can do the same thing. You could count the number of male flowers versus the number of female flowers and report that as a sex ratio. Or we can go through and count again the number of stamens and pistils. And then if we have this other case where you have a complete flower and you have both male and female on that one flower, same thing. Perhaps it's an issue. Perhaps our answer to calculating the sex ratio would be to calculate the number of stamens and the number of pistils. So plants kind of present this unique problem because of the variation in the plant world and the fact that we don't have separate male-female individuals. And we do, but not all throughout the plant world. All right? So, population demographic characteristics. The ones we talked about: age structure, birth schedules, and sex ratios. All right? We talk about these because they all kind of allow us to look at population growth or make predictions about population growth. All right? So with age structure, how our individuals are distributed across the age could reveal patterns in both mortality and reproduction. So if we have a large number of individuals getting ready to become reproductively mature, it suggests that our population is going to be exhibiting some sort of immediate population growth. If a large number of our individuals have already reached the end of their reproductive ages, so they're getting ready into their non-reproductive years, that suggests our populations are going to decline. All right. Also, the age structure, as we see these changes in the numbers as we age, could reveal differences in age-related mortality rates. So things like, when does mating, when does fighting for mates happen? When does when might we escape a size where we're really susceptible to predation, and so forth. Birth schedules, that is how many individuals are born to individuals of the various ages. All right, we use these in conjunction with our survivorship column to calculate our net reproductive rate, which was a measure of population growth. So that net reproductive rate, that R0, is going to range around 1. So if it's equal to 1, we're at population stasis. It's not growing or declining. If it's less than 1, we have population decline. If it's greater than 1, we have population growth. And I told you with this net reproductive rate, you can think of it as replacement. So is our individual actually replacing ourselves fully, or are we more than replacing ourselves, or are we less than replacing ourselves, so incomplete replacement? Because that net reproductive rate is telling us the average number of offspring that each individual produces over their lifespan. And then we ended with sex ratios. Sex ratio of a population is going to reflect sex-specific mortality patterns. So if we start off with 50-50 sex ratios at the primary sex ratio, and then it keeps getting skewed towards, let's say, males or skewed towards females, it suggests we have some sort of mortality issue, or we could have some differential mortality happening that's skewing our population. These ratios also reveal the potential for reproductive rate, reproductive growth. So in normal, I should say not normal, in polygynous species, where the males can mate with more than one females, having a population that's skewed towards females suggests reproductive or population growth. Having a ratio that's skewed towards male suggests population decline. And it all comes down to those females, because they're the ones that reproduce and have the offspring. So are they able to completely reproduce themselves or not? And then sex ratios in plants can be confusing. That's about all we can say about that. All right, leave that for botany. Any questions? All right. No questions. This is 8:15. So in about 15 minutes, the quiz over this demographic characteristics goes live. You'll have until the end of the day on Monday to complete it. So review your notes over the weekend. I'd probably say on Sunday, and then you have Monday to kind of get it done. And then we will move on. So still on populations. So we talked about population characteristics, which included our population size, our dispersion, so spatial patterns, and our demographic characteristics. What we're going to now talk about are the dynamics of a population. How does a population grow? How does a population decline? And especially, or specifically, we're going to learn how to estimate population sizes. Pretty big deal to do this in ecology. All right, so we know populations change over time. Hopefully it's just intuitive. You've learned to acknowledge that they do change over time. Why do they change? Well, they change as a result of four basic processes: births, deaths, immigration, and emigration. All right, so of these four processes, they're broken down into these birth and death areas, all right, things that are in our population, all right, confined to our population. And then we have migration. And these are the things where our individuals will be leaving or coming into our population. We can represent these four processes mathematically, represent their effect on the population mathematically using this equation. And this is our first population growth equation. So these numbers, these are capital letters, they actually represent numbers of individuals. So if we look at our population at our next time point, this will be this n sub t plus 1. Our population at our next time point, it is equal to what our population today, our current population size, plus the number of individuals that are born in the population minus the number of individuals that die in our population, plus the number of individuals that enter our population from immigration minus those that leave from emigration. All right, so this is our mathematical representation of how our population changes. We start with the number of individuals in our population, and then we're going to have births that bring new individuals into it. We're going to have deaths that remove individuals. We have immigration that brings more individuals to our population, and we have emigration that takes individuals away. All right, so I've conveniently kind of grouped births and deaths and migrations together. All right? And I did that for a reason. I did that for a reason because as we move forward in making our predictions, we're going to assume that this migration part is 0. That we're working with a closed population where there is no migration. But in reality, real life situation, we do have this migration happening. All right, so this equation estimates our population size at that next time point, or I should say, represents the population size at that next time point. Sometimes we're interested in that change in the population size. So what we would do is take our population in the next time point and subtract the population size that we have today to see how many new individuals entered or left our population. So that is our delta N. It's a change in the raw numbers of our individuals. And that represents these 4 processes. These 4 things are the basic processes that will affect our population size. What we're going to do is start with movement, immigration and emigration, because in reality, migration is very important for our populations. It's a very important ecological process. But as we estimate population sizes, we tend to ignore it. So we're going to start with movement. Dispersal. This is our one-directional movement of an individual to or from a population. This isn't leaving our population and coming back the very next day. This is we're in our population and then we decide to move and never come back. That's our dispersal. It's not to be confused with dispersion, which we just got done talking about, which is our spatial pattern, spatial distribution across a landscape. Dispersal is all about our movement. All right? Dispersal determines our connectivity. And I know we've already talked about our connectivity, but I went ahead and defined it again here just as a reminder. Connectivity is that link between 2 populations by dispersal. And we talked about how connected populations are demographically and genetically similar to each other. Why is that? It's because of dispersal. Because we have individuals moving their genes into those new populations. You have gene flow that homogenizes it. What effect does that have on our FST values? What is FST? What is it? Yeah, okay, so it's Wright's F statistic, and it's that it measures the variation between our populations. So if we have a highly connected populations, right, if they're very connected, they're genetically similar, which means our FST values are going to be low. So the FST values kind of give us an idea of this connectedness, or at least gives us an idea about how much dispersal is actually happening in our populations. Now, dispersal has costs and it has benefits. And we can think back to the evolutionary ecology part to say that if the costs exceed the benefits, then selection would have taken it out. So we know that dispersal actually still occurs. All right, so there must be something that causes the benefits to exceed the costs. All right, and they are pretty big benefits. So first off, what are the costs? Well, basic cost is energy. You're going to spend energy moving. All right, you spend energy moving, and just moving, again, costs us energy, muscle movements. But not only that, you also have to consider lost energy. Lost energy. So here's an example. You went down to I don't like Golden Corral, so I'm going to say the Asian buffet place. All right? You're at the Asian buffet place, all right? And you had the opportunity to stay there and live there, set up shop. I don't know, maybe you like it, maybe you don't like it, maybe you're grossed out by it. But you set up shop and it's unlimited food for, what is it? What's it cost now? $10? I don't know, Sunday mornings when I was in college, it was $5 all-you-can-eat buffet. That's what I remember. All right? But all of a sudden, we decide we're going to disperse, and we're going to go to try to find some other restaurant. And what we end up finding then is, I don't know, Starbucks. Think about the lost food that the food that we've just lost. So you went from a full-fledged buffet down to a place that serves what? Bagels? Pastries? All right? So this lost energy, the energy cost, don't think of it only as movement, but also as a possibility that when we move, we might not find a better place. And that's going to cost us energy. All right? The second major cost is an increased risk of mortality. We talked about this in terms of migration, right? So migration was very energetically expensive. All right? It also resulted in an increase in mortality rates. Why? Because we're moving, because we expose ourselves to more predators and different predators. Same thing applies for dispersal. If we're going to decide to move our populations, to disperse out to another population, we expose ourselves to other predators, to more predators and different predators, and that results in a risk of mortality. Now, both of these things are costs, and perhaps the highest cost might be the possibility that we never find a suitable area. All right? And that's a pretty big cost, because if you don't find a suitable area, hey, you're going to die. But there's major benefits. And the three main benefits, I've broken it down to resources, or the book broken it down to resources. So first off, it allows us to find new economic resources. And the economic resources that we're talking about is habitat. Habitat patches, food resources, dens, burrows and stuff, new territory, all right? This new economic resources that we're looking for results in range expansion and colonization. All right, so that when we see range expansion and colonization, it's dispersal because our individuals are finding these new economic resources. The second major benefit is new reproductive resources. This is a benefit. I mean, maybe not a major benefit, but if you're in a population where it's 2-to-1 male to females, and what ends up happening is that you form a bond and you mate for life, there's a lot of males that don't find a mate and they don't reproduce. So if they disperse, they have the possibility of getting into an area that maybe it's 2-to-1 female and female to male ratio. All right, so potential mates, finding potential mates, that's our reproductive resources. And our third thing, and probably also a major benefit, is that it allows us to find new genetic resources. And this new genetic resources that we're talking about is really outcrossing. All right? We're avoiding inbreeding by moving and finding a new population to enter. We spread our genes to that population, all right? And at the same time, our population that receives immigrants gets their genetic variation. And this is pretty big because if the environment changes, we hope to have the variation that allows us to adapt. So these benefits do exceed the costs. That's why we see it. Now, what factors will affect dispersal? And there's organismal factors and there's also some environmental factors. So of the organismal factors that affect dispersal, one of the major ones is vigility. All right? So vigility is the mobility of the organism. Can the organism move or not? Organisms that are more highly vagile, that are more mobile, are able to disperse more. They're more likely to disperse compared to those organisms that are basically stationary. All right, so vigility, hopefully, just kind of makes sense. If you can move, you can disperse. Second factor is this propensity to disperse. All right, this is also organismal. Now, this is kind of broken down into both behavioral and evolutionary adaptations. All right, so the behavioral adaptation is our ability to assess the environment itself, assess the habitat. So as we sense that the environment might be declining, then it kind of allows us to say, well, maybe we should move and try to find a new area. All right, if we're in an area, if you're here and decide to stay here in St. Angelo, and then all of a sudden you realize, well, I can't get a job because there's not a whole lot of jobs out there, you assess the environment as not being very good for you. You're going to try to disperse and move to another area to try to that has better resources. All right. The other thing is crowding. So crowding does relate to the quality of the habitat, or it can affect the quality of the habitat. But with our behavioral adaptations, there's some situations where we start to feel cramped, and then behaviorally, we start to get this desire to move on. It might not happen with everyone, or it might not happen with every organism in our population, but some individuals will kind of sense this crowding, sense the increase in density, and say, I'm going to move and try to find a less dense population. We also have an evolutionary adaptation, all right? And this evolutionary adaptation is kind of baked into the organism's desires, the organism's genetic code, all right? So in this case, some organisms just have a natural desire to move, all right? They can't explain why, they just, hey, I just want to move. I just want to go find a new area. And this is a good thing evolutionarily because it helps promote outcrossing. If organisms only relied on their ability to sense these good versus bad environments, then you could have a situation where nobody leaves because the resources are just unlimited and so good that, that it never becomes bad. In which case, our population just basically keeps mating with itself over and over and over again until it crashes due to some sort of rare lethal allele that increases in frequency. So it's thought that this desire to move, when you don't really need to, is kind of baked into our code. Something there saying, hey, a certain proportion of us should be moving, should have that desire to move so that we can outcross and spread the genes and promote genetic variation across our species. We'll talk a little bit about this. It's in terms of two different types of dispersal. There's a saturation dispersal where we don't really move until we hit a high population size. Kind of this with our behavioral adaptations. We don't move until we get to this spot. And then you have pre-saturation dispersal where we're still in a good habitat, still very good habitat, we're not crowded, yet we still have individuals that desire to move. That's our evolutionary adaptation. And I'll point those out when we talk about population regulation mechanisms. All right. I'm going to say the third factor is more about plants. So we kind of say, make a note and say, number 3 is just for plants itself. And this factor is seed design. All right, seed design. How are the seeds made? Are they made for dispersal or not? All right. So a diaspore is the seed and the associated structure that aids in dispersal. So this is a seed. This is, I should say, technically this is a diaspore. What plant does this belong to? Yeah, dandelions, all right? So here's our seed right down here. This is the accessory structure that aids in dispersal. How does it get dispersed? Wind, all right? So this is the structure. We're going to actually have a lab. The very last lab that we do is on diaspores. And I think that is finals week. So it's a pretty easy, low impact lab. But you're going to design one of these things to see if we can come up with a design that maximizes fitness. So if you're being dispersed by the wind, then you're going to want to have some sort of structure that aids in carrying that seed away from the parent plant. All right? But maybe if you're not carried by the wind, maybe if you rely on some other mechanism of dispersal, then you're going to form an adaptation that allows you to get out. So maybe water dispersal is your option. So instead of having something like this, where it's going to get caught by the wind and carried, maybe your structure is going to be something that captures air and allows you to remain buoyant and get carried by the currents and so forth. So for the plants, it kind of comes down to seed design. All right, how does dispersal affect our populations? We already talked about the effect on population size. Jeez, oh man. We talked about the effect on population size. That effect was on immigration and emigration. All right, so if you have high rates of dispersal, it's going to affect I and E. But it's kind of difficult to predict how immigration and emigration will affect our population size in the end. All right, we might have an idea of certain percentages of individuals move. All right, but it could vary from population to population. So this kind of goes back to one of those first lectures where we talked about contingency. All right? Contingency is all of that unknown that happens. We might have all the information we need, and we can make a prediction, but that prediction ends up being wrong. And then we do it again, and our prediction, the exact same prediction, is correct. Those two different outcomes, the role of contingency. There are some things that we're probably missing that causes our difference in the results. All right, so population size, yeah, we're going to see that change, or that's affected by dispersal. The other thing is the genetic variation. We did talk about this. This is connectedness, all right, and the FST values. So, you know, in this spot, you can kind of make a reference to say, see FST values again. And that kind of goes back to other parts in your notes where we talk about the benefits of genetic variation. All right. Now, we didn't talk about the habitat factors that affect it. We will in a few lectures. But briefly, the habitat factors are things like what we call corridors. You know, can the organism get to the area because it has habitat through which it can travel? So in San Angelo, all right, if you have an individual on the west side of the city, I should say northwest side of the city, and wants to get to the east side of the city, yeah, it could go around, or we have the red arroyo that runs through that provides some habitat for our organisms to disperse and migrate, all right? That's a habitat factor, and we'll talk about those in a bit. Any questions on dispersal? All right, birth and death rates. Those affect our populations. Now, capital B and capital D refers strictly to the number of individuals that are born into the population and the number of individuals that die in our population. So we're going to see lowercase letters as well. Now, birth and death rates are the primary reason why populations change in size. It's not migration. Migration has a very small effect on our population size. It does have an effect, but it's a small effect. The primary driver of our change in population size is birth and deaths. Now, what affects births? These four different things. So hopefully resources is self-explanatory. All right? As long as we get resources, we can survive. If we're dealing with a species that has more resources, then they often reproduce more. All right? Either reproduce more times or have more offspring. Not every species can do this, but the idea is that if you have more resource, you can produce more offspring. In some cases, you need a certain amount of resources just to reproduce. All right, so resources, how much resources are there, can affect our birth rates. Access to mates. Now this applies just strictly to the dioecious species, right, because those species, they need to find a mate in order to reproduce. All right, physical limitations will affect the birth rates. So as we said, sometimes our individuals, they can't reproduce, or they can't increase their reproductive output. There's a limit to that. Some species, they're always going to have 3 to 4 offspring. All right? Humans, it's one offspring. And then the rare situations of 2, 3, 4, and more offspring. All right? Some organisms, they don't have that. It's when they reproduce, they're always laying 4 eggs. All right? If they're egg laying and so forth. All right? So the physical limitations, really, I'm talking about clutch size, which is the number of offspring per reproductive event. And then stress. That's going to affect our birth rates. How does stress affect it? Well, it's basically through the effect of crowding. So if we're crowded, we end up getting stressed. Stress, we're going to hear about social stress hypothesis, has this way of suppressing reproductive hormones. All right. What about deaths? What is deaths affected by? Resources, definitely. Again, if you don't get enough resources, you're going to die. Also, this is related to competition. So competition has a negative effect. When 2 individuals compete, they both suffer. I mean, just straight up. When they both compete, they both suffer. They both suffer because each one is trying to get to the same resources that the other needs, which ends up with an overall reduction in our resources. That's going to increase our death rates. Physical factors. These things like temperature, all right, salinity, oxygen content, water, and so forth. All right? This is physical factors. Just, put down in your notes. See the law of tolerance. That's what we're talking about. Predators. Another species. All right? Another species that's out there predating on you. All right? If you have more predators, yeah, you're going to have more deaths. Fewer predators, less deaths. And then the last thing that we'll talk about, crowding. Let's fix that. That last thing was crowding. There it is. Crowding. All right, so crowding affected our reproductive potential. Crowding also has an effect on death rates. Has an effect on death rates through stress and disease. So if we get stressed, oftentimes we start to become more susceptible to disease and parasites. All right? Along with other things. All right? But so crowding and stress can affect both births and deaths, and we'll talk about it with something called the social stress hypothesis. All right. I think we're going to end on this slide here. So where we're moving towards is predicting population sizes. All right? And I've introduced this dispersal. I've introduced immigration and emigration. But when we make predictions about our population sizes, at least in this class, we're going to assume that our population is closed, meaning we have no net migration. So the number of immigrants that come in is matched by the number of emigrants that leave. And that means then that the only things that are going to affect our population size will be the births and the deaths. All right, so our births is the number of new individuals entering, deaths is the number of individuals leaving. Now, as we get to the equations, we're going to break them down based on their generations. All right, so we can have discrete or continuous generations, and we can have overlapping or non-overlapping generations. All right, so the discrete versus continuous kind of comes down to when do they reproduce. For a discrete generation, we have reproduction happening basically all at the same time in our population. So they all reproduce in the spring within a 1-week time interval. That allows us to very easily identify that cohort that's born, because the individuals that enter the population are all going to be at the same age. They're all going to age at the same time. So a 2-year-old individual, we know when they were born, 2 years ago in that 1 week. A continuous generation is one where we don't have that synchronized births. All right, so births can happen year-round, And what that means is that we can't easily identify a cohort. Yeah, some of us will try to identify it and say, well, we'll say everyone that's born in 2020 represents our cohort. But that's such a wide span. I mean, it covers 12 months. Right? It covers 12 months. It's very different than our discrete populations, our discrete generations, where we reproduce in basically like a week or maybe 2 weeks. All right? And so with our continuous births, we don't have the synchronized births, and thus our cohorts are going to be very difficult to identify. So we have discrete versus continuous, and then the other thing is overlapping versus non-overlapping generation. Our distinction here is, will the offspring reproduce when the parents reproduce, when their parents reproduce? All right? So if we have a non-overlapping generation, then we have reproduction that happens by the adults will die, and then the offspring will be reproducing. So we don't have any overlap between the adults and their offspring when it comes to reproduction. Yeah, they can overlap when they're alive, but when it comes to reproduction, they don't. All right? So we never have a case where our parents can reproduce with the offspring, or the parent's offspring is reproducing with the parent's grandchild. All right? We don't ever have that with the non-overlapping. Annual plants, great example of non-overlapping generation. Plant germinates, flowers, set seeds, they die. And then the seeds germinate the next year, they grow, they flower, they set seed, they die, and so forth. So annual plants are a great example of this non-overlapping generation. In an overlapping generation, it's the opposite. Now we have the possibility where the adults can reproduce along with their offspring. All right? And with these overlapping generations, that means then that our adults can reproduce multiple times. So they might reproduce the very first time, and then maybe the third or fourth time they're reproducing when their offspring are reproducing too. And we can have matches. So we can have discrete overlapping. We can have discrete non-overlapping generations. And we can have continuous overlapping and continuous non-overlapping. All right, so we can have all of these combinations. But you can't have both a discrete and a continuous. So it's either discrete or continuous, and then overlapping or non-overlapping. All right? So what we're going to do is we're going to stop here. This is kind of the introduction to our population sizes, to our predictions, to the population equations. On Monday, we will do a quick rehash of what these terms mean, because the equations kind of come down to what we're looking at. And the equations might be similar, but the variables that we use are going to be slightly different. All right? So the quiz went live. I received a notice that Blackboard had a new assessment that went live. So review the presentation that we just finished on the demographic characteristics. Make sure you get that quiz done by the end of the day on Monday. And with that, if you have any questions, please email me. And have a good weekend. Avoid the cold that is coming tonight.